Thank you for your coming. It's a really pleasure to see you here, because this is not the usual lecture. This night's Michalski lecture is important for us, at least on 3 occasions. First, because, as you know, Krzysztof Michalski is the founder of this institute. So the very fact that this intellectual space exists is very much the result of his efforts, of Klaus, of Cornelia, people who started the institute. But he was going to be very happy to know that person who is going to give the lecture is first a philosopher. Secondly, somebody who, like him, has been devoting a lot of his work and thinking around Patočka, who was very important for Michalski himself, and he has been working with him, and the archive of Patočka is here. And thirdly, because this is happening in a moment in which I do believe Krzysztof was going to be very happy to live and reflect on, because he liked interesting times, and we are living in an interesting time. The second reason this is very important is because I'm making this introduction in my capacity of an ex-interim rector of this institute, because just 30 minutes ago, the board of the institute elected a new rector. You're going to see him speaking in September, so you're going to have the intellectual encounter with him, but now you can know the name. And don't start Googling immediately, because LUDGER. And he's an American historian. He's a historian of Soviet and East European history. His name is Michael David Fox. He has been a professor in George Washington University. So in a certain way, this is also important for us, because, as you know, for institutions like this, the figure of the rector is really important. And the smaller the institution, the more important, in a certain way, the rector figure is. And the third reason why this is important is because you don't need to have any introduction of who LUDGER is, because you know him. So LUDGER, please, and he's going to talk about something that is very close to the heart of many of us. Please.
Thank you, Ivan, for this very nice introduction, revealing the big secret of the day. It's great to start with that. Good evening to all of you. There are things for which it is worthwhile to suffer. A sentence that could be carved in stone or in marble. A sentence that speaks to us immediately, regardless whether we like it or not. A sentence that sets a tone, elevated and like spoken from far away, but at the same time with the power to address an innermost dimension, intimate and straight. A sentence also, we have to be aware, that could easily be made fun of, but probably, hopefully, would prove strong enough to retain its dignity even against parody and mockery. There are things for which it is worthwhile to suffer. Existují věci, pro které stojí za to také trpět. Who is addressed? It is a general statement, so that it potentially could mean each and everybody, but rhetorically, the impact is different. The sentence speaks, and maybe only speaks, to those who want to hear it, sense it, take it on. It speaks rather to the few than to the many, and ultimately, maybe the phrase speaks precisely to me, who is expressing it. Am I? You know, whenever it becomes serious, we have to turn to first person singular. Am I willing to take something on me, despite of having the presentiment that it could or would likely harm me? At first glance, the wording might be somewhat reminiscent of the Socratic, "It is better to suffer injustice than to commit it." One of the biggest and most often quoted sentences in the history of philosophical thinking. But while both statements address suffering, there is a decisive difference. The Socratic phrase, prominently formulated in Plato's dialogue Gorgias, speaks about the necessity to make a choice. It very clearly comes out in the passage Gorgias 469. I quote this one sentence: "If it were necessary either to do wrong or to suffer it, I should choose to suffer rather than do it." End of quote. The reason behind this preference is that Socrates, we should say the Platonic Socrates, there's different Socrates, the Platonic Socrates is convinced that doing injustice makes people utterly unhappy. If we only knew how unhappy the doing of injustices makes us, we would without any doubt opt for the suffering. And that means ultimately we would also opt for the reward in happiness. How very different the message of our sentence, the one that I quoted. Forget about any moral reward. Don't trust that the good deed will pay off. No moral harmony, no moral happiness. Yet, and nevertheless, there might be something that pushes you to act, though it potentially only promises harm to you. But you do it because you want things to be right, or better to say, you find things unbearable as they are, unbearably wrong, unbearably violating, and you decide to go against it. Your decision then is not one about having enough knowledge and insight to act in the morally proper way. This was the question of Socrates. Here, we can safely presuppose that many people have the necessary knowledge about how unbearable certain conditions are. There is no lack of knowledge, but it is rather the question if one is willing to act accordingly. And it is somewhat clear that the decision to act in this way will always rather be one for the few. This is important. The circles of dissidents are built in solidarity, and they are very much in need of solidarity. Hence the speaking name of the Polish movement Solidarność, and hence the title of my lecture today that you have here on the board, Shaken Solidarity. But the circles of dissidents also carry a distinction mark that potentially is felt as overburdening and therefore is probably not easily accessible. There are things for which it is worthwhile to suffer. This sentence, you have long guessed, comes from philosopher Jan Patočka. And it is important to know the circumstances of its formulation. Patočka wrote it in a short piece that is called Co můžeme očekávat od Charty 77? What can we expect from Charter 77? It is dated March 8, 1977. That was a Tuesday. 5 days later, Sunday, March 13, 1977, Patočka was dead. He had decided that there were things for which it was worthwhile to suffer, and indeed, he had to suffer for them. In the summer of 1977, he would have turned 70 years old. A few years earlier, he had coined the by now iconic formula of a solidarity of the shaken. This formula has been quoted, used, interpreted, misinterpreted, probably thousands of times by now, and the frequency over the course of the years is constantly increasing. The slogan is originally to be found in a book entitled Heretical Essays in the Philosophy of History. When the book came out, no, I should rather say something else. Not when the book came out, I should change the wording. When the book became accessible and readable as an underground text, that is in samizdat, it was circulated in a few dozen of copies. And often the precondition to be allowed to read this book was the promise to create one's own typewriter transcript, usually 6 transcripts at a time with the help of carbon paper. Patočka wrote a lot. The collected works have started to grow and grow over the years, and one doesn't know how long it can still grow. It's more and more volumes every year. He wrote a lot, but he published very little. He was, as he himself put it once, mainly writing for the drawer. And the drawer is not very good in implementing deadlines. But there was somebody who was good at implementing deadlines. The young Polish doctoral student Krzysztof Michalski. With the lecture today, we honor his name and his role as the founder of this institute. Michalski came to know Patočka in the 1970s, while writing his dissertation on Heidegger in Warsaw. But in Poland, in Warsaw, I missed one sentence. Nobody in Poland felt well equipped to act as a supervisor on that. But in Poland, they had heard about the special fame of a student of Husserl and Heidegger living in Prague. His name was Jan Patočka. I keep the rest short. Michalski contacted him. An extensive exchange of letters, and I would say and emphasize philosophical letters. It's not greetings, it's philosophical letters. There's really work in letters. An intense exchange of letters started. Michalski finished his dissertation and he did something else, very important. He pushed Patočka to write what would become his main work, the heretical essays in the philosophy of history. Maybe we can say, and this is a short formula, but there is truth to it, maybe we can say no heretical essays without Krzysztof Michalski. But even more was to come from this. After Patočka's death in 1977, it was Michalski's firm conviction that he should do whatever was in his power for the dissemination of Patočka's work. And in 1982, when IWM was founded, its first and clear mission for Michalski was exactly to do that. The Polish philosopher who honors the legacy and, yes, the sufferings of a Czech philosopher by founding an institute for advanced study in Vienna. Quite a story. Są rzeczy, dla których warto cierpieć. Somebody still missing from the picture, who is, I guess, in the room here, but wants no applause. Klaus Nellen, the German philosopher, next to the Polish philosopher and the Czech philosopher, was the one who did exactly that, namely, to build up an archive of Patočka's writings. It was the first one, it's the archive here at the Institute. It was the first one that was set up even before the one in Prague that could act only after 1989. And it tried to do everything to publish, disseminate and research Patočka's philosophical work. As I said, there's better occasions for an applause, but it should be mentioned. In what follows, I will speak about the crucial moment when Charter 77 was in the making and the intimate connection with a short period in the life of one of its main authors, Patočka. I will set out what I call 4 probes to explore the context. One could also call it 4 circles of examination. All 4 are centered around the same nucleus, that is the statement that there are things worthwhile suffering for. Step by step, or circle by circle, this will somewhat broaden the view on Charter 77, as well as on Jan Patočka and his intellectual legacy. Each circle will also relate to a growing time horizon in his life. One specific day for the first probe, 1 week for the second, then a period of 3 months, and ultimately the last 3 years of his life between 1974 and 77. First probe, 1 day in March 1977. On Tuesday, March 8, 1977, Jan Patočka finds himself in a hospital in Prague's Strahov. He is in a weak condition, suffering from severe bronchitis that has somewhat accompanied him since the early 1970s. But the recent weeks after the publication of Charter 77, with him acting as one of the 3 speakers for the new movement, have been highly demanding in many regards. He had been arrested and severely interrogated several times. Some of these interrogations lasting for up to 11 hours. But it is not only that. For many years he had lived the life of a private scholar, sitting at his desk and writing for the drawer, since publishing was nearly impossible for him. He had obtained some reputation, for certain people would even say some fame, through the legendary underground seminars that were taking place at private flats or semi-official locations in Prague. This kept him in regular contact with younger people, and that was certainly somewhat essential for him as a teacher and as a human being. For most of his life, he was banned from university and not allowed to teach, resulting in a very private life. Private teaching in the underground was a fulfillment and a joy, maybe demanding at some points, but nothing in comparison to what happened in the early weeks of 1977. Now, that is after his personal decision that there are things worthwhile suffering for, the old professor all of a sudden was in the limelight, not only of the authorities, but of worldwide public attention. When Patočka was hospitalized in the night from March 3 to March 4, he suffered from heavy pressure on the chest, palpitation, and shortness of breath. During the night from March 7 to March 8, finally, the medical treatment had started to be effective, and the patient felt better. He woke up the next morning, March 8, and what we have from this day is the aforementioned text, What Can We Expect from Charter 77? It is a piece of some 5 pages in print, and it is dated by Patočka himself, handwritten and smuggled out of the hospital by his family. It starts off by stating the enormous echo of the Charter movement. I quote from it. "We won sympathy enough. We hardly could have asked for more. But the greater the sympathy, the greater the concern." End of quote. But what is the big concern resulting from this echo? People start ask nagging questions. Will this declaration not make the situation even worse? Is it wise to claim the respect for human rights if some people then have to face persecution, arrest, and a blatant violation of all human rights? Or, and this is the final question in which it all culminates, might not silence serve better than speaking out? Nagging questions, indeed. Also questions that must have haunted Patočka himself for quite some time. And I mean especially the time before his decision to join Charter. But whatever it is, his newly found spirit of resoluteness and resistance, the illness, the possible awareness of his death, we can only speculate, but the answer that Patočka gives to these nagging concerns and questions is remarkable. I quote from his text, "Let us not mince words," he starts out and continues, submissiveness has never led to relaxation, only to greater severity. The greater the fear and servility, the more have the mighty dared, the more they do dare and will dare. Nothing can make them relax their grip except a breaking of their confidence. They have to realize that their acts and their injustice and discrimination do not pass unnoticed, that the waters do not close over the stones they throw. This is not meant as an empty hint at future vengeance, but as the call for an attitude that is dignified, truthful, and unafraid under all circumstances." End of quote. Highly noteworthy is that to him, the philosopher, the inner dimension of the Charter movement is by far the biggest achievement. His reflection culminates in a passage that directly speaks about suffering and why suffering in the current situation is worthwhile. I quote once more. "Note that our people have once more become aware that there are things for which it is worthwhile to suffer, that the things for which we might have to suffer are those which make life worthwhile, and that without them all our arts, literature and culture become mere trades leading only from the desk to the pay office and back. We know all that now, not in the least, thanks to Charter 77 and all it has meant." End of quote. Addendum to this first day. It is probably on the next day, March 9, that Patočka answers to a questionnaire that was sent to him by the West German weekly Die Zeit. It is his very last writing. In it, there is the following question to the philosopher. "What are the personal experiences that you have made with the state offices since the time that you are acting as a speaker of Charter 77?" asks Die Zeit. Patočka, once again handwritten in his hospital, answers the questionnaire the following, I quote, "The state offices, maybe rightly so, have treated me as the least important speaker." There were 3 speakers for Charter. It continued to be like that there were 3 speakers. The first 3 were Patočka, Václav Havel and Jerzy Hayek, who was a politician from Prague Spring. So they have treated me as the least important of these 3 speakers, as an old professor who was somewhat added to the whole setup as a kind of staffage. They did not consider the circumstance that the old professor has tried to be in contact with the young generation, trying to hand on to them some thoughts that were otherwise denied to them, and that he made them aware of the moral side of all intellectual and political issues. It seems that the summons to the prosecutor, as well as the summons to the Ministry of the Interior, testify to a certain change of their viewpoint. Let this passage speak for itself. March 8 and March 9, the intellectual and political testament of a philosopher, were the very last two writings of his life. For the continuation, I cite from the hospital record. In the night to March 11, the condition worsens, leading to unconsciousness, right-sided hemiplegia and aphasia. After a temporary improvement of the condition, the patient becomes unconscious again, followed by terminal pulmonary edema. Second probe, 1 week earlier. I can assure you it's an audience-friendly piece, so each and every chapter is shorter than the one before, so keep that in mind. Second probe, 1 week earlier. Charter 77 was published in the very early days of January 1977, along with the names of 242 signatories, people of quite different political viewpoints, professions and religions. Although the original document was confiscated, copies circulated in samizdat and on 7th of January were published in several Western newspapers such as Le Monde, FAZ and The Times. Also radio broadcasters like Radio Free Europe and Voice of America were transmitting the Charter Declaration that criticized the Czechoslovak government for failing to implement the protection of human rights and something that they had signed themselves in several international agreements, most prominently so in the Helsinki Declaration from 1975. The Charter document describes the signatories as a, quote, loose, informal, and open association of people, united by the will to strive individually and collectively for respect for human and civil rights in our country and throughout the world. End of quote. It emphasized that Charter 77 is not an organization, has no statutes or permanent organs, and does not form the basis for any oppositional political activity. This emphasis on the strictly individual, private nature of any action under Charter 77 is highlighted by Patočka in several of his writings. The reason being that such individual initiative was not strictly prohibited by Czechoslovak law, while any association of 3 or more people could be qualified as conspiracy. Nevertheless, and despite of this emphasis on the private character, nevertheless, the Czechoslovak authorities reacted nervously and harshly. Though they considered the old professor probably the least powerful of the 3, they immediately started to follow him. He was altogether interrogated 7 times in January 1977. On January 5 in his flat, then from January 10 onwards in the offices of Státní bezpečnosti, which translates as state security and refers to the secret police force controlled by the Communist Party. And from January 10 it almost was a daily routine, continuing on January 11, 12, 13, 14 and 17. All the talks are quite meticulously documented by the secret police. We have the protocols from the interrogations, and in the meantime they have been published in a well-documented edition. When I say meticulously, this obviously does not mean reliably, but it rather refers to the bureaucratic character of these documents. Patočka's health condition is not good, but he does quite well in these interrogations. Some of them are documented by the members of the secret police like interviews, so that it says otázka, question, and odpověď, answer. He gives little information, behaves quietly and politely, stresses his moral convictions as the main reason for this acting, and very much presents it as a private decision. After January 17, interrogations stop, which does not mean that the observations stop. Quite the opposite. And now it has already started, thanks to our recording team. We have 4 examples of the observations on screen. Now it will run in a loop 3 times or so while I continue talking. On the first one you see Patočka in his white shirt in front of his house. This is another one. On the first one, when it goes back to the loop at the beginning, you see him in his white shirt coming to the garden, trying to open the door. And then you have these 3. This is like a sequence of people getting to the car. I find, especially these 3, I find almost, if it were not the circumstances were not so bitter, it is almost concrete art, I would say, in this sequential character. We have about 80 printed pages with documentation by the observation teams following Kanál 5, Channel 5, which was Patočka's code name. All bad routine so far, one could say. But there is one crucial incident that drastically accelerates the further process. On March 1, another Tuesday, exactly 1 week before the writing day in the hospital in Strahov, Patočka unexpectedly has some visitors coming to his house. He has no phone and is not in any way informed about their coming. It turns out that it is a group of 5 Dutch journalists who have come to Prague accompanying the Dutch Foreign Minister Max van der Stoel on his official visit to socialist Czechoslovakia. One of the journalists is Anna Francis Salomonson. A piece by her appears in the Dutch daily NRC Handelsblad already on the very next day, March 2nd. Salomonson quotes him, Patočka quotes him, saying, and I quote, "The police wants to know about the people who started the initiative for charter and who collected the signatures. My answer is always the same. I am fighting for a legal thing, and therefore I should not be here at a police station." And it continues, "You ask me if now I am not afraid to return home? I am constantly afraid. But if it were fear that decides for me, I wouldn't be sitting here. In Czechoslovakia, fear is our daily bread." End of quote from the NRC Handelsblatt. Obviously, the interview made the authorities furious. A Czech translation of this Dutch article is kept in the files, which is a kind of proof that they had an interest in persecuting it. But there was something that caused even more trouble. While speaking to the journalists, the journalists, developed the idea that Patočka should meet the Dutch foreign minister himself. So the journalist just took him and went with him to the Hotel Intercontinental, where Max van der Stoel was arriving soon after. The minister and the philosopher sat down for a short conversation. Its content is not so very remarkable. We have a sound recording of it and great photos by a Dutch journalist. The whole conversation does not last even 5 minutes. And van der Stoel's final answer is friendly, maybe even more than friendly, because he is a fierce advocate of human rights. But it is also diplomatic and a bit empty, since he is a politician and aware of the consequences. At the very beginning, Patočka says a few astonishing sentences. I quote, "I am the speaker of Charter 77, but actually speaking I could do only very little until now. It was more about writing, to explain Charter and its meaning, to fend off certain misunderstandings that were especially generated by the big campaign that was started against the Charter. And most importantly, we are not somehow any political dissidents. We are against this designation and we are against the thing itself." End of quote, what Patočka says in his talk to the Dutch foreign minister. His voice on that being very, very slow, very much in the search of words, which was very typical for him, but the health condition and the inner involvement in this definitely made this much, much worse. From the whole talk, one can sense how fully unprepared Patočka is for this meeting and how heavily he is overwhelmed by the situation. Though it is a really short chat between the two of them, Patočka later declares that it was one of the greatest moments of his life. At the end of the recorded talk, you can hear the breaking of his voice. He desperately searches for words, trying to hold his tears and control his emotions. The answer by the police is immediate and fierce. Interrogations are taken up again. And you already know what happens from here on until his death on March 13. Third probe, 3 months earlier. From the tense and heavily burdened days in the first half of March 1977, we will now take a look back at what happened 3 months earlier, that is, sometime in December 1976. It is a crucial moment for the formation of Charter 77. As already mentioned, the declaration came out in very early January, and as indicated by the name itself, it is meant to set an agenda for the new year, an agenda for the new time to come. However, December 1976 is also the moment when things for Patočka personally became different. At least, this is what I would think from reading the papers of that time. We know that in this month, in December 1976, he was writing a piece with the, at first, inaccessible title, Záležitostem plastic people of the universe ADG 307, that is in English, On the Matters of the Plastic People of the Universe and DG 307. it becomes clearer with the circumstances. Plastic People of the Universe and DG 307 were famous underground rock bands, having close connections among them and therefore often mentioned together. The members of these rock bands had been arrested in March 1976. Soon after, Václav Havel and Jiří Němec started a public campaign for their support, because they were convinced that the musicians' arrest was a precedent for the suppression of intellectual and artistic freedom. This campaign culminated in an open letter to the German writer Heinrich Böll, which was dated August 16, 1976, and signed by Jaroslav Seifert, famous for his workers' poetry and later on the Nobel Prize winner for literature, 1984, Václav Černý, a literary scholar, Jan Patočka, Karel Kosík, another philosopher, Václav Havel, not needed to say something about him, and the writers Ivan Klima and Pavel Kohout. It was published among other newspapers in FAZ on August 28, 1976. So, summer exactly 50 years ago from today. The names is a who is who of Czech intellectuals of that time. Patočka already here in the summer of 1976 seemingly had decided to take stands. The campaign was at least partly successful. Some of the arrested musicians were released, others were sentenced to prison for periods between 8 and 20 months. However, the spirit arising from the protest and the ongoing solidarity with the imprisoned ones was a most decisive factor for the formulation of Charter 77. It is in this spirit that Patočka in December 76 sits down and writes the article with his title On the Matter of Plastic People of the Universe and DG 307. The only direct reference to the musicians is funnily made in the title. They are never mentioned again, only in the title. But the message is super clear, and for Patočka standards, it is surprisingly imaginative. One might even say fantastic, since it almost tells a fairy tale. It is the reversal of a short story by Dostoevsky. The short story is Dream of a Ridiculous Man. In this short story by Dostoevsky, it is about one sinful person that arrives at a planet of totally innocent people and obviously manages to corrupt all of them in very, very short time. But Patočka says our cosmonauts, these young musicians, that is how he calls them, he imagines them to travel to some corrupted planet. It's not difficult to recognize that it is planet Earth in the 20th century, and because they are so good-willing and so fresh at heart, they might be able to make a change of the whole planet, to the better, obviously. A fantastic story. Patočka explicitly calls it a miracle, but an articulation of the desperate hopes and unrestricted solidarity for those young people who should be allowed to express themselves. Side remark, Patočka really didn't like the music. For him, music had found its absolute culmination in Beethoven. But it seems that solidarity for those oppressed had in the meantime found in him a resonance that transgresses such differences. At the end of this article in Solidarity for the Musicians, Patočka asks, and I quote, "Yet, what is youth if not a guest arriving from the unknown to begin life anew? Where beginning anew means primarily rejecting, fighting against convenience, against the averaging out, against dishonesty to oneself and to others." End of quote. Fighting against convenience, fighting against dishonesty, to begin anew, to dare to begin anew. I guess that we can see how the path is set for what he will say 3 months later about the necessity to suffer for what it is worth to be suffered for. Fourth probe, 1974. This is looking back 3 years. This, as I said before, the shortest. The formula of the solidarity of the shaken is Patočka's buzzword that was probably never meant to be one. But over the last 30 years, it has obtained an almost iconic meaning. It derives from Patočka's already presented book, The Heretical Essays in the Philosophy of History, written in 74-75, with Michalski putting deadlines, remember? The main reference for the invocation of a solidarity of the shaken for him in that book is to the front fighters in the First World War. That is, to those for whom the seemingly endless and meaningless fighting has shaped a world without any horizon and without any perspective. In that moment of complete exhaustion, Patočka holds, they realize that it must feel just the very same for those on the other side of the trench. What unites them is precisely their total shakenness and an immediate, very fundamentally humane sense of solidarity arises from that. Obviously, this historical reference to the First World War is not the only one. And very much so is the whole idea of the solidarity of the shaken influenced also by the dissident circles and the dissident experiences precisely of Patočka's own time. The underground seminars, the intellectuals working as night guards, the shaken existence of very many people and the unsure existence. Many more things could be said about this iconic formula and its historical references. At the end of it for today, I will put out the most famous formulation of the solidarity of the shaken that the author gives in his heretical essays. I quote 3 sentences. The solidarity of the shaken is capable of saying no to all mobilizing measures. The solidarity of the shaken is being built up in persecutions and uncertainties. That is its front line, a quiet one, unadvertised and sensationless. Unafraid of being unpopular, this solidarity calls silently, without a word. End of quote. Once again, many further references could be made here to the implications and the philosophical and historical importance of these lines. However, according to the main approach of what I wanted to tell you today, I explicitly draw your attention to the last 4 words of these lines. Silently, without a word, is the call of solidarity. I find it most important to stress this as a main characteristic of solidarity. It is not so much, or should not be so much, be an expectation or a demand. It is not even a philosophical description or a recipe, but rather an internal working and an internal fight. Not to ask for solidarity, but to fight with oneself to be able to show and act in solidarity. Shaken solidarity. Jan Patočka, December 1976 to March 1977, is, I guess, an awesome and haunting case for this. Postludium. The burial of Jan Patočka happened on the cemetery of Svata Marketa in Břevnov, Prague 6, on March 16. The state authorities tried their best to make it unworthy. With the use of a helicopter and motocross bikes, they wanted to create the sound of hell and make it impossible to understand a word. People were kept from entering the cemetery or arrested. The police started with arrests already in the center of the city, which is far away from Břevnov. Many people managed to get there nevertheless. The cemetery was full, and the happenings were never forgotten by those who witnessed it. The secret police was taking photos of all visitors from in between the gravestones. A young guy called Ondřej Němec, he was 17 years old by then and part of the dissident groups. This Ondřej Němec took photos as well. sometimes you see in both series of photos, that is the secret police photos and the Andrzej Niemiec photos, the very same people. But one hardly recognizes them, and one hardly sees that it is the very same people, because that's how very different they look. What is it that makes the people on Niemiec photos look so different, like coming from another planet or coming from a more humane world, maybe the world of our cosmonauts that Patočka has described? What is it that makes the difference? I guess the answer is clear. It is a shared solidarity, and be it a shaken solidarity. It is the passion or compassion of the person behind the camera, and a shared conviction. There are things for which it is worthwhile to suffer.